Hi, everyone. Welcome to another panel at the Chilliwack Independent Film Festival. My name is Kirk Cooper. I'm the moderator for this panel, which is called Queer Storytelling in Film. And we have a lively, I think we're going to have a lively discussion today. And we have some really great panelists that join us. I'm going to present them, and we're going to get going. We're going to have some questions at the end, so save all your questions at the end. We will do a Q&A with the audience at that point. So this obviously would happen to me. My computers went to sleep. So to start off, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, and that's Jasmine, Otter, Monton. They, them, that is their pronouns. Jasmine is an artist and media producer based in Vancouver. This past year, they were part of the Vancouver Queer Film Festival Emerging Programmers Fellowship and curated the 35th Annual Film Festival. They proudly offering perspective and unsolicited wit as a non-binary, and you're going to have to explain this to me, Filipinx?
Yeah, Filipinx.
Filipinx, okay. Person. Jasmine's work centers around gate reaping or challenging industry gatekeeping through creating more opportunities for historically marginalized communities. They are a co-producer for Filipinos Fridays podcast, and they are in the moment developing a season focused on queer trans stories. Welcome, Jasmine.
Thank you.
Next to Jasmine is Lauren Marsden, and she is an award-winning queer filmmaker and media arts artist of European and Trinidadian descent based in Vancouver, BC. As a storyteller, she focuses on narrative and experimental work that revolve around gender, Caribbean identity, and the human impact on the land. Her 2022 short film, and I may pronounce this incorrectly, Tabanca, okay, has screened at 30 festivals around the world, including BFI Flair, London, Inside Out, Toronto, and the Shorts Film Festival in Japan. Welcome. Oh, I'm so sorry. There is actually more. That is why I had that look from you.
It's okay. It's okay.
I didn't realize that you had to jump to the next page.
Keep it short.
With 2 decades of media arts experience under her belt, her creative work has been presented by Pacific Cinematheque, the Koffler Center of the Arts, and the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival, New Media Gallery, Antimatter Film Festival, Cineworks, and I believe this would be San Francisco MoMA. Mm-hmm. Okay. She holds a Master of Fine Arts from the California College of Arts and the Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Victoria. My apologies. Welcome.
That's okay.
Now.
Thank you.
Okay, and our last panelist is Jason Karman, and he has a Master of Fine Arts in Film Production and Creative Writing from the University of British Columbia. Jason's films have traveled internationally, focusing on Asian diaspora and the LGBT stories. His short film, Lions in Waiting, was selected by Telefilm Canada, Not Short and Talent at Clermont-Ferrand in 2018 and screened at the BFI Flair in 2018. His debut feature, Golden Delicious, is supported by Telefilm Canada, which is the Talent to Watch program, and has traveled to 57 film festivals internationally, receiving 13 awards. It's now available on digital and on demand in several countries, including Canada, the UK, and United States. Jason is a directing member of the DGC and a proud member of the Asian LGBT community in Vancouver. He is currently working on feature film projects with Julie Anthony and Norman. Sorry, I do Spanish, so I was going to say E, but Norman Y. Lee. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you.
So I want to begin by just something fun before we get into the real serious nitty-gritty of talking about the challenges we may face telling queer films, in particular in Canada. I thought let's start with queer movies and what was your first queer film that you saw, and perhaps a queer character that you identified with. For myself, I will start. The first queer film that I saw was Maurice. It was I forget the name of the two that came together, Merchant Ivory, I believe, film. And that was a long time ago, so you all don't know how old I am. I was quite young when I watched that film, and I thought, wow, these stories can be told. There's someone there that I saw myself in. However, they were of not my skin color or not my experience, but when they discussed sexuality, I saw myself in that. It was not until way later I saw Moonlight, and then I saw myself as the younger version of that young man, Sharon. So I am just wondering, what are some films that impacted you as you were growing up and helped you to hone you to this today?
Do you have an order for this? I'm like, oh, do I can go?
I will be looking at you first, Jasmine.
That's so
Is that
unfortunate.
okay?
Yes. The reason I'm like, oh, this is so unfortunate is because I think if we talk like film, like movie, the first one I can remember in theaters was Black Swan, like Darren Aronofsky. But the problem is I watched that and then I was like, I'm afraid of Natalie Portman, which is like very irrational. But every time she's in a serious role now, I'm like, stop, Natalie, please. So yeah, that wasn't that fun, but great movie. And then I think like, outside of that, on TV at the time, Pretty Little Liars was playing, and like I was obsessed with Shay Mitchell. And I remember coming out to my cousin and she was like, you're not gay, you just love Shay Mitchell. I was like, that is gay. So it's, thank you, Shay Mitchell. She's Canadian, she's Filipino, yeah. Oh, to her.
Well, I'm sure somewhere along the line she's going to find this and go, oh, I have a great fan there that I helped.
Exactly. She didn't scare me. So.
What about yourself?
I have to talk about Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which I think I saw when I was maybe 19 or 20 and still figuring out my own, gender identity and orientation and all of this. And wow, what an amazing film. I actually watched it again just a few days ago. And I thought I'd only watched it a couple times, but I must have watched it more than that because I still can anticipate all of the dialogue. Like, I think it just had such a big impact on me, or I did watch it many times over the years. But we definitely had a DVD of it at my house back in the early 2000s. And I think it just really showed me what's possible in terms of storytelling in queer identity where there's self-love. And it's just such an amazing film. It's so amazingly done, and there's animation in it, and the animations are really impactful, and it's very expressive. It's very punk. There's so much music. I'm not big into musicals, but it's a musical, and it's just, I think James Cameron Mitchell's a genius, and it really opened up my mind. And also I felt very seen in it, even though it's not exactly who I am. I think it tapped into a kind of aesthetic that made me feel at home. So yeah, and now I'm starting to see the influences a little bit so many years later. Yeah. It
can actually, resurface in those ways in your art and how you project your art out into the world. Yeah. And Jason, what about you?
I think 1996 was my pivotal year. I was exposed to two films, Beautiful Thing from the UK, which is a coming-of-age film by Hetty MacDonald, and what struck me was the how positive it was. It was a film about two young men in the social projects, and they just wanted to be together, but their families and their income level kind of made things more difficult than it needed to be. And it was done to the mamas and papas, and it was just very empowering and uplifting at the end, and that struck me. And then that same year, I also saw John Grayson's Lilies, and that's a Canadian film, and that showed me that showed me how gender fluid people can be. That's a story about a couple of male inmates who trap a priest and recreate scenes from what happened in the past, trying to uncover this kind of hidden love. And all the roles, male and female, were played by the male inmates. Yeah. And it was so beautifully done, and it was so diverse and, again, gender fluid and tender, in that, it opened up my eyes on what queer storytelling could be. So, yeah.
Right. And now, of course, you mentioned that the gender fluidness of it, in Lilies or Hedwig and the Angry Inch. Sorry, I can't even say it properly. And
it's a mouthful.
Yes, it is. And then you had Black Swan, or should I go? I don't know.
Let's take Black Swan today.
Okay.
For 500. Yeah.
Although Black Swan, I don't know if I would consider that to be very queer centric, but these films all need actors in it. And back in the day, we noticed that we were faced with a lot of actors who are not queer themselves, taking up these spaces and telling these stories. And I think they did wonderfully, like actors such as Michael Douglas that did, the film Behind the Candelabra, and Kate Blanchett for Carol, or even recently Bohemian Rhapsody, where I know Rami Malek was, he was criticized the heaviest for his role as not a queer person, or even to the point where they didn't think he was the best person for that film. He was criticized. And recently we see Bros, where that changed this, in the last couple of years, where I believe it's Billie Eilish, who historical decision to just make it all queer, mainly the most, major characters queer, changed that landscape. So what do you think about that? Have we break through the wall now, or do you think Hollywood really haven't heard us?
I can answer that question because I've been asked this a couple of times on the festival circuit.
Yeah.
In my opinion, I don't think an actor's sexuality should play into whether or not they could get the part, because it's none of our business. I'll be just frank. An actor, if the actor can have range and can convince us of that character, can embody the essence of that, then why should we deny that? I understand the politics of that, right? But as a director, my priority is performance. Not necessarily another check mark where, for example, that person is queer but not the best performer, right? I have an obligation to put the best to get the performance in the film, to have a good story, right? Versus I check off this, I check off these other things, right? I'm not making a PSA. I'm making a scripted narrative feature. So there's that aspect. Also, I make coming of age films, I can't force young people under the age of 19 to come out. It's unethical, right? How can I? We watched Monster last night. I can't imagine having to force those young actors to come out to prove to someone, right? So that's another thing. And then lastly, I've also worked with actors who are still in the closet. And I have to they tell me later on, this is what they were working with. They weren't ready to come out. So who are we to push them to come out, right? I may have sensed something inside them, and that's why I chose them. But again, it's not my place to say, come out for this role, please, right? So anyway, that's my point.
Well, no, I appreciate you being so honest and so open about it from your experience. I just I want to hear from you too as well, because there is a public side to this where people are saying we're not happy. The gay community are saying we're not happy to see that actors who are gay not getting these roles as well. So I hear your side, and I would love to hear what you have to say as well. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Lauren.
I mean, I'm thinking, there's like one's sexuality, there's one's gender identity, and then there's gender expression. And I feel like there are all these different layers. And if you can, like, I'm thinking from the perspective of a writer and director, try to, even as a writer, you can't necessarily have lived experience for every single character that you write. And you try to understand your characters through writing and try to understand your characters through directing. And likewise, actors will try to understand their characters through acting. And so there's this magical space in between all of that where identity on screen gets formed. And so I agree. I hear a lot of what you're saying, Jason. And I think in terms of things like gender expression, we know it's performance. And so why can't an actor also play with gender? But at the same time, I think it's really important to be very clear about the characters that you want in a film. So, for example, I've got a genderqueer protagonist in a feature that I'm working on, and I'm really specific about that, but I also will trust that who will come out for that role would have something that they identify with it. And it isn't for me to police that, but hopefully that I could build a trusting relationship with them where if they have questions for me, that I could answer them, or that we could figure it out together. And I think, especially in a gender fluid space, I think there's lots of different ways that can be expressed through dialogue, through physical movement, through the way that they're styled. There's so many ways to get there. And so I think having a certain amount of trust is how you can do that ethically. You asked a question about Hollywood, and I don't know if I can speak to that fully. I'm just getting my toes wet now in that world. I think that if you are working with companies, producers, and financiers who are queer, that's a great start. That's a great start in terms of having that understanding of how to do things in a responsible and ethical and authentic way. But not everyone is that, and there's a lot of learning to be done. There's still people are having a lot of problems with pronouns in screenplays. They're having a lot of problems with even understanding what genderqueer or queer or LGBTQ, and people kind of trip up on it. And so I don't think there's any one right way to do it, but yeah, there is a little bit of, sometimes there can be a little bit of friction there, or, there might be companies that want to check off the box.
Right.
But they're not really as concerned about how that's done. So something to be careful with for sure.
I'm so glad you put it that way. I think it's really easy to make actors like the scapegoat of just everything that happens, because they're who we see right in front of us in the screen. But I really love that you even mentioned that as a writer director, you're not going to have every lived experience, and that's the exciting part about it, is being able to use your imagination. And so I think if people are asking for okay, let's have authentic queer stories, they can't just put that onus on actors. They need to see it as that's a community work, right? And I think they advocate for that, saying we're an audience, and so we know what stories matter to us or feel genuine to us. And so I think what we've seen is that maybe they do have I'm sure there's actually who's not queer in Hollywood? That's just my thought. But anyways, probably. But
newsflash.
Yeah, those directors, those writers, they will. I'm hoping that they have somebody in their community who understands that experience enough for them to have been inspired by it. But if you're a writer and director with ill intent, or an actor with ill intent towards the LGBTQ community, that will show up, I think, in your daily life and probably on screen. And so I think some of the alarms, maybe that's where that comes from, but maybe it's also just kind of a lot of that without thinking again about who is the film community, who has their hand in it, the investors, right? If you don't have that relationship with them, then I don't, why are we putting that story out there? Because I'm used to seeing queer characters, trans characters as the butt of the joke in Hollywood movies that I grew up with. So, I think that's responsible. Yeah, the way that you put it.
Yeah, I think thank you all for your experience and your knowledge on this and your thoughts. I think you guys are wonderful in what you had to say there. But you touch on something very interesting, Jasmine, and it echoes what Jason and Lauren has also said. But it's two-part: the financiers, those who have the money and who are controlling the purse string, and then also the community that you're trying to reach. Now, I'm going to switch a little bit. I was hoping to do this at the end, but since you brought this in, there's been such a rise in the way that the trans community has been dealing with persecution, murders. Let's call it what it is. They're murdering trans people. Even drag queens are having such a backlash for the things that they're doing, which is an art form, but people are not understanding that, and that rise is coming out of the lack of empathy. So there is the concern that when you're producing something, who are you going to reach? As a creator, how do you work with that in your space in terms of trying to maybe try to reach them empathetically with characters, or do you send messages in your stories, your piece, your films?
There's so many different kinds of stories, right? So I don't think there's any one way. And if we start to just have one kind of story, then we have a problem, right? So I don't know. I mean, Jason, you have so much more experience, so I feel like
I started out in documentaries, and so I see. I try to find the truth in behind. So I try to find the truth on screen, and so I think empathy is finding those nuggets and then working that into the rest of the narrative. But specifically, like I think it comes down to, how can I say this? We're working in an age where everything is fragmented and it's hyper stylized, it's heightened, and it's also politicized, very polarized, and so I think that empathy comes from just empathy comes from. Sorry, I'm just kind of thinking. It's a great question. It's about trying to invite people, disarm them through humor, while also showing them something very relatable. People don't like being preached at.
Right.
So I think it's a fine line, and storytelling is an art form, and so. There's some tricks for me that help me to create empathy, and that's music. Music transcends. It transcends so many things, right? And you can evoke something within somebody, and then make them kind of realize why, or ask them themselves why. So that's one trick. I mean, I could go off, but I just wanted to say that, my background in documentary filmmaking and my understanding of dance on film has helped me kind of create more empathetic pieces,
right.
And knowing also that catharsis is really important in drama, because it doesn't make it preachy. So.
I'm sorry, I was trying to hold that in, but I can't. Let's go back to that. I want to just add another piece to it. Thank you for that, Jason, because that is actually what I thought might be a good way to sort of meet in the middle, try to reach individuals and gain some empathy for a community that is struggling at this point. But when I asked the question, I was wondering, not necessarily do you have to create the project, but do you keep that in mind when you're creating something? So that part I wanted to touch on, and Jason tells me how he keeps that in mind, what can tap into. Do you have anything that you tap into that you think this might bring that message through clearer to the audience from my work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, programming this year's festival for Vancouver Queer Film Festival, Our goal in this was that people would leave with a sense of queer joy. And so that required making sure that we're displaying our community with empathy. And the way that we went about it is, you're watching a film and you start to ask yourself questions about who you are or who your friend, who maybe is a drag performer, would be if they sat through this and watched this. And I guess that's just kind of like what I'm asking myself when I'm looking for queer media too, is like, if this was me, am I the hero in this story, or am I the one who's like, am I just like a joke in the story? Am I a villain? Am I a cool villain at least? Because I think that's fine, because the other question is, am I complex, right? Is it falling flat? And even if I'm like, maybe that story is like not me at all, like, I think we can still ask the same questions, is like, who is this character or this story that they're representing? And what is that going to say about the real life people who are living through those experiences? And I think that was what really helped us feel like we were programming something that made sense for our audience, but was also enjoyable to watch, versus like, coming to a theater and you're like, I'm scared. I'm going to see something that's like hard or like reminds me of something very difficult in my life.
Or make me feel guilty about how I feel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nobody wants that. So, almost in the same line. Oh, sorry, Jason.
I was just going to add one thing that I noticed is I tried to look at the age and demographic of the filmmaker and the target audience of their of the film. So usually, like, let's say, I've noticed like a lot of coming of age films are told by older white cis men, right? And if they're trying to tell a contemporary coming of age story, they try to remember back to when they were young, 20 years ago, with no social media, and everything was much more simple, right? And so I think that if they're not mindful of their target audience, I can pick up on a sense of privilege and judgment, and that can erase or cancel the empathy that they're trying to go for. If that makes any sense.
It does make sense, because now I'm thinking about also the stories that are told, and you're just sharing with us about how the age gap in the time in some of the stories that are being told are out of touch in some ways. And I was wondering, because these stories that we tell, can we envision a world where queerness is a matter of fact, but not the source of every struggle that we see? Or that is the main struggle for the queer community, and not something as you said, maybe that's lighthearted, like is more relatable to anyone, not just queer people in the queer community.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big deal for me, what you said about queerness as a matter of fact. I mean, I think, again, like going back to this point that when I think about empathy, it can happen on so many different registers. Like, queerness is desire, it's disappointment, it's fabulous, it's also mundane and boring, it's dream
but we
space,
hardly ever see that
it's reality. I know, and that's why I think, so I think when I'm writing and I think about my own lived experiences, but I also think about the world that I want to see on screen, or the world that I want to see in the world, I think about the things that I haven't seen. So like the mundane, or where queerness isn't a struggle. I think it's very important to also tell the struggle too. But I think what I have to offer maybe sometimes is a little bit different. Right. So, and I think it's a way to get away from damaging tropes sometimes, but it can be all things, and all of those things I mentioned, like desire or dream or the everyday. We of course can all relate to that. So if we see queer people experiencing those things, then hopefully there is some entry point for maybe someone who's not queer to say, oh, I felt that too. And you know what I mean? So yeah.
You feel like you want to add anything to that as well, Jason?
So your question is about
not making queer struggles so focal point in everything we do.
Okay.
In our creative work.
I agree with you. I think that's where queer stories are trending in the Western world. I can't say in the developing world. I think it's when we make stories, we want to know we're often comparing with what's made. And what's made is a lot of these coming of age stories where the queer struggle is the focal point. And I think as we mature, we're starting to find ways to celebrate the mundane, celebrate the loneliness sometimes that queer. Older queer people experience, many of them. So I think it's. I agree with you. I'm working on projects which don't have that as the focal point, the struggle, but more about just wanting to have children as a queer couple, for example. And that
is relatable. I mean, it's out there. There are gay couples who are trying very desperately to have their own kids.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, now I want to talk about gender fluidness and non-binary characters in stories, particularly with, the pronouns they, them. As for yourself, Jasmine. And I'm wondering, maybe Jason, you can speak to this more, and I'm not sure if both of you will be able to, because you've actually done your feature, and I'm wondering what it was like on set if you had anyone who was referred to as they, them.
Yes.
How was the crew? How was the crew in terms of understanding that these pronouns are important to the individual they're speaking to, and did they use them appropriately?
Yeah, we had our production manager was Eli Morris. I'm not sure if you know who Eli.
I know Eli.
Right?
Why are they everywhere?
With our set, it wasn't a big deal because me and Kristen, we set a tone of inclusivity, and if somebody forgot, we weren't going to shame them. It's a work in progress, right? And we didn't have any issues with that at all, to tell you the truth. But I know that some people do have challenges using that. But it's just familiarity. That's all, right? And not shaming if they forget or if they screw up. I think people are just so quick to conclude and judge these days.
That is true.
Yeah.
And Lauren, your film Tabanca, did you have the two characters? Yeah, two main characters. I saw it. Great film. Yeah, I'm wondering, was there any pronouns that was given to any of those characters?
Yeah. So the main character Marlon, who was played by Aneka Kroll, who's with us here today. In the script is written as they, them. And I'm developing a feature with that same character. Pronouns are they, them. And that was a really conscious choice on my part. So the character is written as a genderqueer woman. And that's something that's very particular, but can be interpreted in a few different ways. And I actually thought, okay, I could have she, they pronouns, which is my lived experience, and those are my pronouns. But then there's something about having it be they, them pronouns, and now writing a feature script. It's super interesting. It's like a gate that if someone isn't willing to come into that space with me and with the project, okay, bye. Because I think it's a struggle for some people, because think about it from a production crew standpoint, like a first AD is going to read a feature script where the protagonist is only referred to by they and them pronouns. They might question how many people are in the room, even when there's just one person in the room. You know what I mean? And so they're starting to think about how are we going to schedule this shot. So it has these sort of technical implications. So it is asking a lot, not just for any reader, but especially for production crew, to really embrace these characters who are non-binary or genderqueer or gender fluid. And I've had a bit of resistance, and I've been working on this script for a number of years now. And some people read it and they say, I've never read a script with a character with these pronouns. And it takes some work, and I wanted that work to happen. And we're getting there, and I feel like we've got a lot of producers and we've got a lot of people on board, and everyone's coming on board. So even something so simple but significant as pronouns really brings everyone into the fold to say, this is the kind of story we're telling. And I think it opens up a lot of space to think about, okay, what does this mean in production design? What does this mean in costuming? What can this mean? Like, it sort of expands the possibilities for a character or multiple characters. And so it's been really... I don't know if lots of scripts are using they, them pronouns now, but I did it, and I'm like living it. So,
That's incredible. No, that's incredible.
But I'm sure some people were like, oh, this is too much for me. I'm just not going to. And that's okay. They can go another way.
Well, I was speaking to, I won't say who the director was, and they said to me that they just refer to everyone as they. And it's just easier because if you do, then you're not offending anyone. Because even a he, she is still a they, you know, when you don't know what that person's pronoun is when they first arrive. So they welcome everyone as they. You are welcome, they. And then afterwards they can say, I am he, she, or he, his, she, her, they, them. And you move on from there. But what about, Jasmine, what has been your experience? I know you're in the cultural space, but I guess at the Vancouver Queer Film Festival, it is probably very known to apply the proper pronoun to the filmmakers and to the people who are attending the festival.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, I don't know, for me, I'm like, this is kind of a funny question. Recently, Bella Ramsey from The Last of Us was like, being non-binary is the least interesting thing about me. And yes. And like, so at the bare minimum, sure, like our pronouns. And that's fantastic. But I think it goes beyond wanting to like, oh, I don't want to offend anybody. And if you're applying that in your art, in your practice, it's because you want to honor people's stories and their experiences. And I love that you were saying like, oh, because we get to write about a character who uses they, them pronouns, maybe then we get to write a story about a gender fluid experience. And, you know, when we're talking about like, how do we make empathetic stories or show that? It comes from understanding that queerness, transness, it's so beyond just like what our pronouns are, who we're interested in, what our body parts are. And it's like in the stories that we tell, and maybe it's like in the mundane things. And I'm really fortunate to have like my first festival experience being the Queer Film Festival, because they're really great at honoring people's stories, whether you're on the staff there or you're in the film there. But one of our goals too was like, as we're watching things and looking for stories that represent our experiences, we were looking for non-binary stories. And there was one in particular called, what's it called? Before I Changed My Mind, Canadian filmmaker.
Trevor Anderson.
Yeah.
I know his story.
Exactly. Yeah.
He removed all pronouns in his script and just kept to the names. Right?
Yeah. And so I'm like, you know, you might already be writing these characters that are reading as non-binary, right? Regardless of the pronouns that they were using. But in that story in particular, it was intentional that nobody knew what that character's pronouns were. And in a way, it was like the central part of the film, but not in a way where people were just like struggling to be like, oh, what are your pronouns? But it was a character who's like, what is my experience then? Because this is happening to me and this is happening to me and the world is saying it should be like this, etc.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know. It's a story. It's a question or like a thought to me that I'm like, oh, you know, I think they, them might be among us, you guys. And so, like, it's there. It's not hard to, and especially if you're working in a creative space, I hope we all have the imagination to try using different names and taking on different identities.
I just wanted to add that the Vancouver Queer Film Festival is at the forefront of like gender expression, because Drew Dennis back in the aughts, is it the aughts? Yeah, in the early 2000s used to run, and Drew was Drew was Drew. Like that, we were all educated on how to address Drew without pronouns, and so. I don't know if you know who I'm talking about.
I'm like, the effects are there. Like we're like, you know, just being 35 years in, I'm like, the effects of what.
And that was early on. And it still is today.
So
nice.
I just want to add that even though a lot of Hollywood seems to celebrate the youth, there's a lot of queer history around, and Drew is an example. So.
Yeah.
I just want to add one thing is that, I mean, not all queer spaces are the same, right? And so I'm thinking about like when I'm working on a film in Trinidad and Tobago, and the queer space there is very different than it is here. And I found that so the ideas around gender queerness and non-binary identity aren't as visible or talked about. It's quite stigmatized. I think there's a lot of, even within the queer community. So I had a lot of like queer women coming to me and saying, how dare you do this? I don't know, or I don't understand this, and like just really agitated by it. And I was like, realized my privilege as a Canadian person, you know, kind of, or coming from an urban center and going there and casting. And I was like, okay, I need to take a step back, and we need to like really open up this conversation to be a bit more sensitive to the local cultural nuances there. Yeah.
You actually stepped right into where I was going.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, great.
I was going to ask first to Jasmine. I was going to ask, what do you think about, especially what Lauren says, in terms of countries that still have, you know, laws that criminalize people who are queer, and persecute people who are queer. And people who have not accepted it, even if it's on the books and it's, you know, legal, they still haven't accepted, the population hasn't accepted, and they still behave in an irrational way towards queer people. Being at the festival, do you guys consider that when it comes to the art form that is coming from those countries? Do you say, well, we're supporting this, but doesn't that mean we're supporting them culturally? Or do you separate the two?
Yeah, I think it's culturally, I'm knowing that queer people, trans people exist all over the world, and where they are in that is going to look different. And so in that moment of time, like it, you know, like, okay, spoiler alert, Monster was queer, but I knew that. But anyways, showing that and seeing that, like, in that, if it was coming from like where it's filmed, the ways that they're showing it is like so culturally shifting, because they're trying to push, right, to say like, this is what queerness looks like. And sometimes you only get like a little bit of space to be able to tell that story. And I think we should still platform that. That's essentially my idea here, is like, you know, whether your queerness looks like something that for someone else was like their story years ago, there's so much validity to that. And like, I'm privileged to have like grown up in Canada. And so like, I don't know the struggle the same way, but I think when you're programming a festival, you have to have the curiosity for it, okay, of like, what does that look like for you? And how has that affected your queer experience?
But also having the filmmaker there, I'd imagine would help with the education, and to also put into perspective that the audience can understand what the climate is like, where they're from as well, I imagine, for you. Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the best things about like when we got the filmmakers there too is that also meant we got to create some breathing space for them, where it's like, oh, you know, like I'm right now, like I'm in a spot where I don't always get to be around queer community. Actually, there was some filmmakers who were just like from the States who are like, you know, like you think like, oh, like, wow, you must be around queer people all the time. But they're like, no, this is like amazing. Like I get to be in this space. And that's just because of like what they're going through and where they've grown up. So it's great to be able to like, if you're bringing in all sorts of stories that way, you don't know what kind of opportunities you're making, even for the filmmakers, but for the audience too. Because, or I remember like at your screening too, someone stood up and was like, we're from the Caribbean. I was like,
that was a moment I will never forget. Yeah. We had a like nice, we had like intersectional family going on there in that moment. It was felt really nice. Yeah.
And Jason, what about you? Have you ever experienced any of this when you're traveling with your film? How people take in your film from Canada, where I hate to use this word, we're a little bit more tolerant. I don't know what that really means. But the landscape where we're able to take up space isn't as challenging as maybe where you go with maybe your film. You find that there's more challenges they have there?
Like in 2 weeks, the film is playing in Slovakia, in Bratislava, and at the Slovak Queer Film Festival. And I believe they've just selected someone that is similar to Trump there, and is very right wing. So I think like your film, Canadian films can act as a way to show the world how queer relationships could be, like, you know, could be positive, happy, could be empowering. It doesn't have to be always about that struggle, right? So I think we do have that privilege of being able to offer, societies that may not be able to have the same freedoms as Canada.
Will you be going with the film as well?
I've been to that festival before, and I won't be going this time. But it is like going behind the Iron Curtain, and everybody on the apps are all black. What I mean by that is, like, you can't see what's on there. Everyone's in the closet and very, very, very careful with what they say, because they do feel repercussions, and so it's really, you do feel very privileged being there. I've also seen at BFI Flair there was a program of Nigerian queer films, and they brought Nigerian filmmakers over, and it was they were so thankful, to be able to just be themselves. But I know they had to go through so many hoops just to get there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm Jamaican myself, so I can relate with you, Lauren, when you talk about being in Trinidad and what you went through. And yes, to some extent, it could seem like we're mightier than thou, and when we speak and when we try to push our feelings and sentiments out into the world, and people are just not ready. So I get what you're saying in terms of maybe let's take a pause, let's understand how we can connect the two and work towards a better goal here. It's a slow process from where I'm from, because a lot of films are not shot in Jamaica because of that. And funny enough, some of them do get shot in Trinidad because they're a lot less, how should I say this, aggressive in how they speak about their unconscious biases around that.
And there were changes legally in Trinidad recently. Some anti-sodomy laws were overturned in recent years, and so things are changing for the better, sort of systemically in Trinidad. But there are still no protections for discrimination that is gender and orientation based. And it's one of the things I have to think about logistically. Okay, where do we do our casting that's safe? And so we do our casting at a queer casting place. It's already a queer space. Our locations are often also already queer spaces, a queer nightclub that is, like, I will not consider any other location, because I want to know that it's already part of the fabric of the queer community there.
But is someone helping you with that? Who helps with that?
We have production services. I've spent a lot of time there, and I've lived there, so I know those spaces, and I have relationships in those spaces. So it's not like I'm starting from scratch. I'm kind of building on years of experience. But yeah, it's hard because not everyone wants to come out. And I don't want to out anyone, of course. So yeah, it's delicate, but a big thing comes up with immigration as well. So we might be bringing in actors to Trinidad, and technically it's illegal to enter Trinidad as what they say in the law, homosexual person, which, it doesn't, how could that be interpreted, right?
A lot of the laws down there need to be changed. They're just not enforced, and no one really think about it, but they're still on the books, unfortunately.
So I have meetings with, like, the High Commission, and I make a lot of noise about it.
Are they being helpful?
We'll see. We'll see. Because it's not up for us as individuals to change it. I think it's up to the people,
because we're not there. We can't push the envelope because we're so far away. It's the people that are there who are voting and politically in charge, I hope they are, about this subject, can make a difference. Like we did here in Canada. All right. It's time for some question Q&A. I went a little bit over. I was hoping to give you guys 15 minutes to ask some questions. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Hi.
A lot of the time in filmmaking, there can be a lot of gatekeeping. Have you noticed a difference sort of between the more straight-centric space in film versus the more queer space? Is it more open in that way, less gatekeeping of resources and just like advice and learning from each other?
I surprisingly can speak to this. Yeah, it exists, very unfortunately. Even down to like us, like what my role was like programming and curating the festival. And because, the straight or like primarily straight festivals have had so much time to grow, have many more other resources. Sometimes we would have it that we had films that we're so excited about, but our little festival just wasn't as big as like the big guys out in Canada. So we're like, okay, we'll let you go. Because we're like, we want to support you in that way. And so that's not to say like the gatekeeping, like it's kind of a weird gatekeeping that way, where it's like for us trying to get queer films in, right? I think for queer storytellers and filmmakers yourself, like maybe there's some hope there in knowing that like, oh, okay, so you can still go for like those other festivals, bigger spaces as well. But I will say that recently I got very mad about a film festival that played an Elliot Page movie, and
Yeah. Is that from a city I came from?
It could be anywhere. I don't know. But my only problem actually was more on the marketing side. And they interviewed Elliot Page. I was so excited to like watch this like little clip of an Elliot Page interview, and I'm looking through all the comments, and it was just so transphobic. Right? And like, I know that's not technically gatekeeping, but that's not really being safe with your gates either, where it's like, all right, like, I'm so glad that you're willing to show our communities out there, and how are you protecting them? Mm-hmm. Right? Because like, Elliot Page has so much more accolade and money than me. And like, you couldn't even save him in the comments. Mm-hmm. So I think, yes, like we're gatekeeping in like the traditional ways, unfortunately, but also there's a lot of amazing like queer trailblazers, trans stories that are also making their way there, and those festivals are very interested to see it as well, which is great.
So regarding your question about gatekeeping, I just want to point out there's also gatekeeping also happens with the white gay community against the BIPOC queer community. Yeah. An example would be Outfest. I feel okay to say this: Outfest and then Outfest Fusion. So Outfest is the big LGBTQ festival in Los Angeles. They require premiere status, but for some reason they always seem to delegate all the BIPOC films into their smaller BIPOC Outfest Fusion Festival. Really? They never mix it together. Mm-hmm. Same thing's happening with Tampa as well. And so people are wondering, well, what's wrong with our stories? We're just trying to make a good film, and now you're saying that we can't we're not good enough for the Caucasian queer community festival. So it was just so the people who programmed that, I don't know, for some reason they just can't seem to get into their heads that we're good enough, we can be part of the main festival and not be sidelined, right? To have a specialty festival just for us.
Well, thank you for saying that. I didn't realize, and I'm going to take a look at that. I really watch to see what's coming out of that. Yeah. We had another question. Oh wait, did you?
Oh no, great comments. I have nothing to add. Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Hi, thank you so much for being here and talking to us. As a young person who's like just started to work in film, I've been in a few situations sometimes where like the story of the shows that I've been working on have had queer storylines, but there's been this sort of like tacit almost approval of like this, not inconspicuous because they're not smart about it, but this like homophobia that is pervasive, or transphobia, queer phobias that are pervasive amongst crew and amongst people who are not outwardly facing, are not the actors, are not the faces of the stories or the shows that we're being a part of. I would love to know what your experiences have been with compromise and deciding where your lines are when you decide what is and isn't appropriate to happen around you, especially for someone who's young and isn't in a position of power really yet. Fingers crossed. To be in those situations where you're like, I don't agree with that. I can't stand that those people are free to say those things or do those things or be that way in this situation, but I'm not in that place to make that change and make that choice. What do you think is a way to get through that?
I feel like, I just feel, I guess I can really only speak to being in a position as the writer, director, producer. Usually like I'm already seen at like the top of the pyramid. And so I have a lot of power and I'm a bit of a bulldog. Like I would just protect everyone that I need to protect and would fire someone probably, but I think it's important to have conversations with anyone who's been victimized first to make sure that they're okay. But I think starting a production from at the very beginning, at the very outset, having things like anti-oppression training be part of the budget and be offered mandatory, and just make sure that you set the tone. So that's, I guess, a responsibility that I feel. Like, let's set the tone to do the very best we can to prevent any sort of like homophobia or transphobia or misogyny, et cetera, on set. And then, I don't know, I guess I just take it on personally as my job to deal with it if it happens, because I'm the one who started the project. But that's the only lens I have. I'm guessing maybe you're talking from a different crew position potentially. I do think that the producers of the project should have that responsibility on their shoulders to protect the crew. That's my feeling on it.
Jason?
I've heard many horror stories of toxic work environments, and I think it starts from the top. And if you're called in for a day call, right, and then little things, for example, when if they allow people to introduce themselves with their pronouns, that's a nice, that's very good to hear. If they do land acknowledgement, that's also good to hear, because I know some people just won't deal with that. They'll dispense with it after the first day. Well, there's a reason why we go through the process, right? It's respect. If you can't respect that, then I think then there's other things that might fall by the wayside. So just when you go on to set and you hear how other people talk to each other and treat each other, then you can know how where people stand. And just asking about who holds creative control on a queer story. Is it the studio, some ambiguous organization, or is it the director, writer director, for example, right? And that's how you can know, hopefully, that person will preserve or make sure that things are not tokenized. So.
Yeah. Honestly, I'm having the same question, and it's whether I'm in film, it's whether I'm in any other sort of industry, and I'm thinking about it. And I think it's hard. It hurts to think like, oh, do I have to compromise something? And so what I've been looking for instead has a lot to do with like the culture. And this sounds like so sad for me to say. I'm like, I think I'm kind of used to this idea that anytime I might run into somebody who's racist, who's homophobic, etc., and that could be in any workplace. But what I want to know again is like, so who's around me in that culture, and like what questions will they allow? I really value spaces that have like kind of like a lateral leadership or like flat leadership, right? Where it's like, it's more peer-to-peer. So if I'm in a set where it's like that, where even though I'm a young person, if I have this idea, if I can even be considered and allowed to say it, I think I'm in a good space. Like, it's okay if someone's willing to sit down and discuss with me, good. That's all I'm hoping for. And like, if I'm really feeling like this is like against my values and hurting me, I think I'm also just optimistic in knowing that, really great leaders exist. And even now where I'm thinking about like, what would it look for me to be on a set? It's like, I would rather talk to all the filmmakers that I met from this one festival, because at least I know and I hope that it's going to go well because they have that baseline understanding. So maybe it's not about compromise. Maybe it's just like what is the culture, and are they going to allow you to have the agency to ask questions?
Right, and kudos for asking that question, because it seems like you're thinking ahead for yourself. You say you're not quite there. You're not one of those powerful people, but you're on your way there. Despite that question.
Yeah. And also just really lean on your community. Because what I'm reminding myself is like, even if I'm not like on a big set right now, there's so many other queer and trans spaces that are going to fill my soul. And maybe sometimes you just have to make something really silly. Like we're like, I had a bad day on set. Let's go make a really dumb short film right now. You know, just young people our age.
Well, there you have it. We'd have no more questions. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of this fabulous discussion of queer storytelling in film here at the Chilliwack International Film Festival. I'd like to thank our guests, Jason, Lauren, and Jasmine Otter. I love saying that. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you all for joining us.